And without further ado, I'll introduce the two panelists who we have the distinct pleasure of hosting today. So the first speaker will be Dr. Jyotsna Puri, the head of the Independent Evaluation Unit. She'll take us through the findings and recommendations that have emerged from the synthesis on the accreditation function. Our next speaker will be Mr. Lars Roth. Lars is a Deputy Director in the Division of Climate, Energy and Environment in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he's also a member of the board of the GCF and has recently taken up responsibilities as the chair of the accreditation committee. So once we hear from both Joe and Lars, we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. With that, I'll hand over the floor to Joe. Joe, over to you.
Thank you so much, Archie. I'm going to share my screen just because we're doing this in different rooms. If you could admit everyone, because currently they're appearing on my screen. So I'm going to hand over that charge of admitting everyone over to you, Archie, while I set myself up. Thank you, everyone, for making it today. And the way we're going to run this session is that I'm going to try and speak for about 15 minutes. And then I'm going to invite Lars through Archie to give us his comments and reactions to the overall evaluation. And before that, I do want to do a little bit of a pitch. So this is the report that Archie was referring to. And we also have a two-pager, which is essentially a brief summary if you're just interested in this one. So I'm going to encourage you to read the full report. It's really rich and it's very exciting. Can you see my PowerPoint screen in PowerPoint mode? Archie? Yeah, okay, good. So this is the IEU's independent synthesis of the GCF's accreditation function. I'm really privileged to be here. I'm Joe, and I head the Independent Evaluation Unit at the Green Climate Fund. So like Archie said, this synthesis review was requested by the board as part of the IEU's overall work plan at B24. Really important for me to note before we go further that this is a synthesis review, so which means that this is not a full evaluation. It essentially collates and exhaustively collects all relevant documents of the GCF, within the GCF as well as outside the GCF that may be related to accreditation and synthesizes them after critically appraising them for quality. So we've taken a look at all of the evidence within these documents. We've seen as to what qualifies as high quality evidence, and then high quality evidence is then synthesized and provided for you so that you can distinguish between what is evidence-based and what is not. In the overall synthesis, the independent synthesis that has been undertaken by the IEU, which is this report, we're covering 4 areas. We're first looking at policy, and we're asking, what is the policy framework within which accreditation is located? Then we are saying, within that, how is accreditation governed and how is it operationalized in the GCF? We're also asking questions on process. How long does accreditation take? What are the challenges in the process? Third, what is the current accredited entity portfolio? Does the current portfolio align with the GCF mandate? And last but not least, what are the projections? What are the results? How do accredited entities report on project results? And much more relevantly and pertinently, how does GCF1, or the draft version of the updated strategic plan, consider accreditation, and what can it do better? So let's jump very quickly into the policy framework and governance. Just as a recap for folks who may be new to GCF, although all of us know GCF quite well now, we know that the accreditation is provided for within the governing instrument. The governing instrument essentially allows for accredited entities, and the board overall oversees accreditation as a function. We also know that the business model, which is laid out in the governing instrument, lays out that accredited entities will be responsible for the design, delivery, management, implementation, supervision, evaluation of GCF investments while meeting GCF standards and safeguards, and which is why accreditation becomes really important as a function, because it's really the gatekeeper for everything else that the GCF can do. Now, importantly, and in the report as well, we lay out that accreditation and what has been espoused by the GCF was based on the experience of many other multilateral agencies. But very importantly, we also recognize that within the multilateral system, the GCF is quite unique in how it has brought on board the accreditation function. So the one thing that the GCF has uniquely is this idea of direct access, and much like the adaptation fund, but like very few others, it has this provision for direct access, but importantly, it does not limit the number of accredited entities that it might engage with. In the overall report, we actually do analyze what other agencies and their experiences have been through accredited entities and the extent to which they have been able to mitigate risk, but also to do due diligence. So again, I'd encourage you to look at it. So the first point is really on governance. In terms of governance, on paper, actually the GCF has done a pretty good job of laying out what should be the key elements of governing this gatekeeper function, right? So we have the accreditation committee, and that's a subcommittee of the board. And we have the accreditation panel. And of course, we are very privileged to have Lars, who is the chair of the accreditation committee, recently appointed to be on this panel as well. Within the accreditation committee, it's constituted by 6 board members. According to many members of the accreditation committee, as well as those outside, it wasn't completely functional till recently. The accreditation committee and many times would not have quorum. And this then meant that it translated into the accreditation committee not being able to take a lot of the decisions that it potentially could. In a limited document that was also circulated to me and to within the board as well, the accreditation committee, along with a few other subcommittees of the board, was also ranked low on effectiveness, efficiency, and suitability. And that's something that the accreditation committee itself has really tried to address and talked about in a very engaged way, as it has discussed some of the potential functions that the accreditation committee can fulfill. Importantly, the terms of reference, which, like I said, are very rich on paper, haven't translated completely to practice. And that's actually one of the emerging recommendations that we make as well. There is then also an accreditation panel, and much like the accreditation committee, which is really well constituted in terms of its membership, the accreditation panel is also very well constituted. It is an independent panel to provide expert assessment to the board, at least on paper. However, so far, it has had limited interaction with the board and with the committee. And this is something that the accreditation panel and the committee would like to redress. The accreditation panel assessment so far has been technical, but in terms of their own engagement with the overall GCF strategic vision, and therefore their ability to engage with potential candidates on alignment with the GCF vision has been quite limited. So far, the accreditation panel has not taken any negative recommendations to the board. And again, much like the committee, its terms of reference, although very good, are mostly on paper and have not translated to practice. Then we, within the governance structure and the overall policy framework, we try to look for an accreditation strategy. And so far, the accreditation strategy is absent. Right? So for us as the independent evaluation unit, for us to assess as to whether the current portfolio of accredited entities was the right kind of portfolio in terms of number, diversity, mandate, due diligence, and other functions, was very hard for us to understand and infer, primarily because there is no strategy that lays out what are the primary, secondary objectives of accreditation as a function, but also of accredited entities. There was a draft strategy that was circulated at B14. However, this did not include a vision, KPIs, or expected outcomes. And an accreditation framework review was also started at B18, but has not yet been adopted. When we looked at the overall mission in terms of an accreditation function, I think it's clear that currently there is mission overload. So depending on which part of the overall GCF system you're speaking to, there are a variety of opinions within the GCF system as to what the accreditation function can and should be helping the GCF fulfill. If you speak to some of the secretariat staff, they'll talk about paradigm shift. If you speak to some of the board members, they'll talk about country ownership. Still others will talk about reducing risk in terms of the sort of investments that the GCF is undertaking. And still others will talk about getting accredited entities so that the private sector can be engaged with in climate finance. And these are only few of the objectives that accreditation as a function has been asked to undertake. What this has also meant is that every time that there is some kind of a shortcoming within some part of the GCF, unfairly, accreditation gets blamed. And this is something that we do think can be redressed very quickly, but it requires concerted action. So unfairly, if there is some part, country ownership is not working or direct access entities are not coming in, accreditation gets blamed for it. And that's why even more, it becomes more important for the GCF to consider an accreditation strategy, because that mission overload will then not exist. And it'll become very precise in terms of the overall aims of what accreditation is meant to fulfill. We also looked at a possible theory of change for accreditation, and we found that overall, many of the assumptions that are being made in accreditation remain unsupported. So currently, GCF has a large number of, allows any number of accredited entities. Direct access entities are supposed to enable country ownership. Capacity development is supposed to be undertaken by international accredited entities. But a lot of these assumptions that are currently there in the theory of change, we find very little evidence for it. And it would be really important for the GCF to build that evidence to see whether this can actually operationalize on the ground. In terms of process of accreditation, what we're finding is that there is a 3-stage process that has been adopted by the board. So you apply phase 1, you get onto the online accreditation system, you go through phase 1, phase 2, you come to the board in terms of an application, and then there's of course AMA effectiveness. Board approval, just coming to board approval takes about, on median, so that means 50% of the entities that have been approved by the GCF board of the 95 took a median number of 506 days to get just board approved. And then after that, there is AMA negotiation, right, to get to effectiveness, which is the first step before which FAAs can get signed and money can actually go to the accredited entities. And that still takes another 600 days, more than 600 days on average. So overall, we find that legal negotiations take a lot of time. So there are many causes that we analyze again in the report that cause these delays and long accreditation cycles. But what we find is that legal negotiations that take place before as well as after board approval does mean that this process is more protracted than one would expect. A lot of this is caused by non-compliance with GCF policies, for example, AML, CFT, and restructuring policies. And that means that this process, which is quite lengthy, like 19 months even after board approval, are far lengthier for accredited entities with the higher risk category. Yeah. or for international entities. And we're happy to talk about this during discussion. But when we were looking at this overall, when we were doing this overall synthesis, we found that of the 5.6 billion that has been committed by the GCF, $1.7 billion of this portfolio was still under FAA or AMA negotiation, which is quite a large percentage. Then we looked at the portfolio of accredited entities. And this is not surprising. Accredited entity portfolio of the GCF is currently dominated by international accredited entities. But to its credit, overall, the 95 entities that the GCF has accredited have a variety of scope and result areas, right? Which is good. But 10 international accredited entities have 73%. So almost 3/4 of the GCF's overall portfolio, and international accredited entities, in terms of the dollar value of the GCF portfolio, 86% of the overall dollar value of the GCF portfolio is held by international accredited entities. 18 accredited entities of the 95 that have been approved do not have funding proposals, concept notes, project ideas, etc., and or have withdrawn projects, which means that they are not engaging at all with the GCF. This is important. One other objective that has been very often cited to be one of the objectives of accreditation is capacity building. So we asked the question, is accreditation helping to build capacity? And the evidence on this is unclear. We find that accreditation is neither effective in assessing the capacities of accredited entities, nor is it a means for systematically increasing the capacities of direct access entities who come and join the GCF ecosystem. Of the 56, so 95 accredited entities have been brought in. Of the 95, 56 are direct access, right? So 56, of the 56, only 18 direct access entities have funding proposals with GCF. We also find that there are little incentives for either building capacity or reporting on capacity by international accredited entities. And therefore, climate alignment of these entities and alignment with the GCF is unclear. So interestingly, one of our colleagues, Temur Beck, who's also on this call, worked with Archi and I, who are also, and I should have said this at the beginning, so Archi is also a co-author on the report, as am I, and as is Temur Beck, and we have Asha, and we have Archi. Sorry to interrupt, but you'll give me a full list. Anskar and David. Anskar, I'm sorry, yes. Anskar was is also a co-author. So, but when we were doing this analysis, we found that we wanted to understand whether the accredited entities' own portfolios were moving or not, as a consequence of both accreditation or just engaging with the GCF, right? And that's sort of one of the other assumptions of accreditation, that as soon as they become part of the GCF ecosystem, that we'll start to influence the accredited entities themselves and make them more climate sensitive, more pro-climate. So Temur Beck did this analysis and he looked at the portfolios of 7 international agencies that have been working with the GCF. And if you look at your screens, then my cursor is essentially showing 2015. 2015 is when they were accredited by the GCF board, right? So these entities, including ADB, EBRD, AFD, World Bank, etc., what we are finding is that their portfolios didn't really dramatically change to become more pro-climate. So there's no clear trend in terms of the AE's own portfolios becoming more pro-climate. That's important. But the accreditation process itself does not analyze a shift in the AE portfolio. And we also find that there's no incentive within accredited entities to shift portfolios or really to even measure that shift towards climate. There's nothing that we are doing currently to move that portfolio towards climate or asking for them to report it as a part of the overall accreditation process. The last part before I come to recommendations, projections and results. So we looked at the last version of the updated strategic plan, and we found that accreditation or a strategy for accreditation did not feature in the updated strategic plan. There is this ambition that there will be an increased share of direct access entities in the updated strategic plan or in the first replenishment period of the GCF, so in GCF1. But when we did our analysis and we looked at what was the ambition of GCF1, I beg your pardon, we found that even if the GCF doubles the amount of resources that are being allocated to direct access entities in GCF1, overall, as a percentage of the $16 billion that the GCF will have as part of its old fund and will have committed, this will only represent 25% of that 16 billion by the end of GCF1, right? So that's 2023. By the end of 2023, even if the GCF was to double the amount between 2020 and 2023, overall for the 16 billion, that would still be just 25% for direct access entities. And I think we're going to leave it to the board to try and see whether that's ambitious enough or not. Then we also looked at the project-specific assessment approach, or PSAA. And we found that in its current version, it does not address the question around accredited entity capacity. The fact that currently GCF's overall pipeline tends to be supply driven, so it's driven by the entities rather than GCF taking the lead and creating the supply for a certain type or profile of projects. There is currently a backlog of entities in the overall accreditation process, and that needs to be cleared. And so the overall load that this will impose, that PSAA will impose on the GCF secretariat system needs to be considered. We also found that there was very little consideration of due diligence and risk management. It would definitely be important for the GCF secretariat to think about a strategy for PSAA. I'm going to come to recommendations now. We have 4 recommendations. So first recommendation, we're saying strengthen the governance structure for accreditation and critically address the mission overload. And within this, I think a pivotal question will be developing a strategy on accreditation within the GCF system. So that's relevant to the GCF system. But also within this overall strategy, think about reinforcing the terms of reference of the accreditation committee, examining the role of accreditation within GCF and its value for the business model, and strengthen the accreditation panel. One other thing that we thought about is thinking about accreditation and FP approval strategically. So again, I'd love to discuss this during the Q&A. Archie is looking at me thinking, okay, I've got to finish, so I'm going to try and do that. But importantly, we think of certain models where the GCF can think of accreditation and FP approval in a synchronized way, where the burden on accredited entities to provide information to the GCF is reduced, the burden on the secretariat is reduced, and the overall optics around the system are also improved. And this can be summarized as a low-high model. That is, in the first case, there's lower due diligence during accreditation, but higher due diligence during FP approval. So this is the FP approval stage. Or consider a high-low model, where there is higher due diligence, so there's a very small circle through which you have to pass through. But after that, for FP approval, basically everything that is, all agencies that are accredited can go through. And this then is a synchronized and strategic way to think about both accreditation and FP approval in a way that is systematic and system-wide. Overall, our recommendation is be strategic. The second recommendation is to, we are asking the GCF to consider assessing and incentivizing capacity building and aligning accredited entity portfolio with the GCF mandate. In this, think about institutional performance, alignment of entities, building capacity, and efficiency of processes. In the third recommendation, we're saying give guidance, and this especially for the Secretariat, on the selection of accredited entities and the overall composition of the accredited entity portfolio. Within this, the Secretariat should support NDAs to strategically nominate for direct access and not just do a first come, first serve, and really think about providing post-accreditation support, especially for direct access entities, and doing that in a very intentional way. And our last recommendation is clarify the aims and the limitations of PSAA before piloting it, because there will be some challenges and it's good to be ahead of the curve. And in GCF1, think about strategic planning that should include targets and plans. So within PSAA, we are saying, clarify what are primary aims, how will these be achieved, consider lessons from other funds, improve reporting, and identify ways in which direct access entities share in the FP portfolio will increase. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was really insightful. And I obviously have a conflict of interest. I'm also a co-author on that report, so very insightful. It's not right for me to say that, but thank you so much. Lars, over to you for your insights and thoughts into the report as well as the accreditation function overall within the GCF. And colleagues who've just joined, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box or raise your hand and we'll give you the virtual floor at the end of, towards the end of the, in the second half of the sub. Thank you.
Thank you, Archie, and many thanks for inviting me to join this session. Let me also take the opportunity to commend you, Joe, and your team for your outstanding contributions throughout the years to this institution. You have done tremendous things and we are very grateful. This report, I believe, comes at a very timely moment. As you mentioned, the board is currently working on an updated strategic plan which will guide the GCF operations throughout this replenishment period that is for the next 4 years. With the GCF branding itself as a learning institution, I think we are well served to take on board as many of the recommendations coming out from this synthesis report as possible, because many of them are spot on. Certainly, you managed to identify the key issues, and you also offer guidance on how to address the many issues that are still outstanding. I think, Joe, you referred to it in your introduction that accreditation is the key business model of this fund. And yet, we still have to develop an accreditation strategy. That is one of the key findings coming out from this report, but it is also one of the key recommendations coming out from the country ownership evaluation. It is one of the key recommendations within the forward-looking review. So this is outstanding for a long time, and so we have a unique opportunity to address this within the USP. Now, equally important is, of course, and this is alluded to in the report as well, for us as an institution, and certainly for me as a member of the board has yet to define the purpose of accreditation. What is it we want to accomplish? And I think it is about institutional reforms, about fostering institutional reforms that can help to support a paradigm shift, to have a transformative impact. And equally important, it is about partnering with institutions that can support the GCF in its mandate. Yes, of course, accreditation is about strengthening country ownership. It is about direct access, as you have spoken about. And so direct access entities have been prioritized from the beginning. Sweden has been a strong advocate of direct access since the early days. My mentor in my early days at the board, Jan Cedergren, was chairing the accreditation committee. As you alluded to, the GCF is unique in that regard, with only the adaptation fund being close to working with direct access entities to the extent that the GCF is already doing. Now, at the same time, we must be able to look at more than one thing at the same time. While we focus on increasing the share of direct access entities, increasing the share of financing that is flowing through direct access entities, it is obvious to me that accreditation offers a tremendous opportunity to foster institutional transformation, and by doing so to contribute to a paradigm shift that goes far beyond from what the GCF can accomplish through its own financing. By making it mandatory for GCF partner organizations to develop a gender policy, the GCF does contribute to strengthen gender work in institutions that may not previously have focused on these issues. At the same time, there is a tremendous opportunity to provide incentives for entities to reduce their carbon footprint and to shift their overall investment portfolios away from fossil fuels in order to be considered for reaccreditation. Because yes, you're right, this is currently not something you're looking at the moment of accreditation, but what many in the outside world of the GCF may not be aware of, that there is a lot of work going on in what in board or GCF lingo is called the baseline, where the accreditation panel already back in B11 was tasked to establish a baseline for accredited entities to calculate their share of investments within their overall investment portfolios that goes to fossil fuels, and to make it clear that at the time of reaccreditation, which is happening 5 years after, this is going to be a key element on which entities will be assessed upon, and whether they will be proposed for reaccreditation or not. So there are incentives, but the incentives are coming at the moment of reaccreditation. And this is key, because if this actually will work, then the GCF provides incentives to shift global financing flows from the billions to the trillions. That is way beyond what GCF can finance with its own financing. And that is why we do engage with entities that today have a large carbon footprint, because if we want to shift from the billions to the trillions, it is these institutions that we need to work with, and it is for these institutions that we need to provide incentives to green their overall portfolio. At the same time, of course, accreditation is an essential tool to achieve what we all want to achieve, and to increase quality, scale, and impact. And this is, of course, buzzwords coming out from the replenishment, and they reflect the outcomes of the forward-looking review. So you're absolutely right, Joe. We must start thinking more strategic about accreditation. We must start to prioritize among incoming accreditation proposals, and to choose partners that are best suited in supporting the GCF in its work and in it fulfilling its mandate, rather than what is the case today, pick on a first come, first serve basis. PSAA, as is also referred to in the report, and which currently is being worked on within the updated accreditation framework could be an important tool in that regard, because it could offer a way in for institutions that may not be able to seek accreditation to the GCF, but to have highly innovative funding proposals, concept ideas that could be implemented through the PSA. So that is an important tool as well. We have to realize that we are running out of time and that we only have a few years left if we want to be able to stay below the 1.5% degree target. And so it is important to have a discussion on what vision we do want to see. If you follow the discussions at the board throughout the years, I think there is a struggle between two different visions at this point of time. One where the GCF is seen as an ATM with the sole purpose to finance climate action in developing countries based on country submissions, while the other vision is about mobilizing financing at scale to make the most out of the funding that is available to the GCF, to be more ambitious and to foster a dialogue to support countries to develop truly transformative and paradigm shifting projects, and through supporting institutional reforms. This is all done through accreditation. So this is key. I share your conclusions that efficiency needs to be strengthened and that a lot of work has still to be done in regard to that. And you offer valuable guidance in that regard. We know what has to be done in terms of governance reforms and the way we as committees function in terms of increasing capacity with the Secretariat and the accreditation panel. And I think also a key recommendation is to provide support to accredited entities, both before they get accredited, which we already do, but also once they have been accredited, in order to help them to develop the truly paradigm shifting climate action proposals that we are all looking for. So to sum up, accreditation is key. A strategy is key because we need to become faster, we need to become better, and we need to become stronger. Or as I constantly refer to at the board, we need to increase quality, impact, and scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lars. Those were very candid insights and candid thoughts on accreditation, the report as well, but accreditation and its overall placement in the GCF. Lars, if I may, I might pose a question to you about, you've taken up responsibilities very recently as the chair of the accreditation committee. In the report, we've spoken of the institutional infrastructure on accreditation, and the board has set up the committee, the panel, the secretariat, and the various responsibilities of all of those different parts of the architecture. What would you think, do you think that's sufficient for the committee and the board to carry out its functions, or do you think some of that might need reforms? And I might also at the same time pose a question to Joe as well. Joe, you've spoken about incentives for institutional incentives, not only in this report, but previous reports as well. What are some of the incentives? And you speak of it from the perspective of being trained as an economist often. What are some of the institutional incentives that we could exercise that the GCF could make use of in delivering its mandates? So Lars, if you could share your thoughts, and before we move to Joe, thanks.
Yes, happy to. I mean, I fully share the findings that were shared in Joe's presentations on the fact that on paper, the governance structure that is in place looks all good, but at the same time, we know that there are many gaps that still need to be addressed. That is not only true for the accreditation committee, which I am a part of, but it is true for many of the committees set up at the GCF, and that is a clear recommendation coming out from a review of all committees and panels and groups at the GCF that yet has to be addressed and discussed at the GCF board. So we need to work on governance. We on paper, of course, should play a strong role in the accreditation process as such. But as a matter of fact, our mandate as a committee is rather limited, and it is also true that interactions between the committee and the accreditation panel, as well as between the board and the accreditation panel, are rather limited, and so there are currently very limited, not to say no, discussions on strategic issues and where we are heading to. So the work of the panel is rightly described as rather technical, and that further underlines, of course, the need for a strategic guidance, which still has to be developed.
Thank you, Lars. Joe, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Archie, and thank you so much, Lars, as well, for actually taking on a lot of those issues and finding resonance with some of the issues that we raised. On the incentives question, Archie, I think one example is this idea that clearly within the accreditation function, the overall idea is that international accredited entities, for example, will help to build the capacity of direct access entities. And one can see that it could be a very symbiotic relationship where international entities who bring the multilateral finance architecture and also the thinking on climate could help direct access entities who are far closer to the ground, who understand climate priorities and understand the realities of the context that they're working with. So if asking the international entity community to work with direct access entities and to build their capacity, on the face of it doesn't seem like an impossible thing. But we have to create the choice architecture so that this is exactly what international entities choose for themselves as well, right? And so this is really insights taken from behavioral science. And one idea that we have floated earlier as well is for international entities as well as direct access entities, at least for a part of the portfolio, make it mandatory for them to co-present, co-develop, and co-implement funding proposals that come to the GCF. And that way you build the incentives for both direct access entities as well as international entities to work together and to build that symbiotic relationship that each one can benefit from the other and has the incentive to work together. So that idea of twinning could be one that the GCF could definitely employ from within its mandate and operationalize on the ground, the idea of twinning. So I'm going to stop there